podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Hello, welcome aboard. Welcome to the seminar on globalization. What we're going to tackle this week is not only a fashionable but also a hot issue. Indeed, globalization touches such issues as global markets, global competitiveness, but also poverty, wealth gap, global mafias, money laundering, and global warming. And of course, the global crisis casts light on the spillover effect between countries and between regions. Globalization means that there is no periphery, there is no shelter, basically, from crises. The first globalized crisis ever is not over yet. It is recast, it is refashioned, but the few signs of economic recovery here and there, are not enough to get rid of the structural imbalances in the world economy and to shift the growth model from GDP increase to sustainable development. This is the key challenge of globalization. What is sure also is that the meta-narrative of globalization being the springboard of sustainable development for all is no longer taken seriously. The crisis is not just a cyclical crisis, it's a system crisis. This time is different. In fact, we're going to tackle two issues which are linked but not similar. On the one side, we have the worldwide network, what I call in the Pearson book, la mondialisation. Now, the worldwide network is as old as mankind. It stems from an endless expansion of exchange of goods, services, people, information, and values. Since day one, people wished or needed to move across geographical or political territories. The so-called global village, where one knows almost everything regarding almost everyone. This worldwide network means that people rub shoulders with each other. And rubbing shoulders can be fruitful, but also tough and harmful. Globalization is something else. It emerged more recently in the 19th century. It accelerated with the anti-IC revolution. It has to do with competitive market forces. Now, the first analysis of the worldwide network has probably to do with Herodotus 2,500 years ago. That's the first worldwide vision of mankind. He is the father of history. And probably the first analysis, critical, of globalization stems from Karl Marx in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, the 1850s. He writes Das Kapital in the British Library in London, together with his friend Engels. Now, this worldwide network, as I said, traces back to the origin of mankind. It grew rapidly at the time of the Phoenicians and the Greeks, mainly in the Mediterranean basin. And it grew still more rapidly with crucial technological innovations in the 16th century, the so-called Renaissance, and in the 19th century, and a few years ago, with the anti-IC revolution. Indeed, people move goods, ideas, information, and values faster and faster across physical and political borders. This is, in a nutshell, the global village. As you can see on the screen, it has a lot to do with demographic expansion that multiplies exponentially the scope for cross-border exchanges. Initially, probably 2 million years ago, demographic expansion started, in north of Africa, Europe, and it spread gradually towards the east, Asia, Latin America, and today, basically, we have 7.1 billion people on Earth. What is striking, is the watershed in demographic expansion after the Renaissance in the 16th century and in the middle of the 19th century. Indeed, in the 1850s, the world reaches 1 billion people. then 2 billion in the 1940s, and in 2000 it multiplies 3 times to reach 6 billion people. And it took only 13 years, as of today, 2013, to reach 7.1 billion people. What is also striking is a major improvement in life expectancy after the Industrial Revolution. Until the Renaissance, 16th century, on average, people lived that much, around 30 years, even though Louis XIV lived 77 years. But what is also more striking is a large and growing gap that emerged in the beginning of the 20th century between countries. On average, people live 40 years more in highly developed countries such as Norway and Japan than in poor developing countries such as Zambia, Angola, or Lesotho. Now, globalization is a worldwide expansion of the market economy. It touches not only industry and banking or finance, but it touches every field of economic and human activity: culture, education, services, entertainment, media. And since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, with the meltdown of the Soviet Union, globalization, the market economy, touches each and every country. I've been traveling in probably more than 80 countries, and I've seen that globalization, competitive market forces, impact not only on Poland and Hungary, of course, but also in Vietnam, in Cuba, in Bulgaria, even in Burma. In a nutshell, a global economy means that it's an echo chamber, no periphery, no shelter from economic, financial, and geopolitical volatility. And also this meta-narrative that the Western growth model of capitalism and democracy is the only model of development, this is challenged more and more, particularly in China. Now, who coined this concept of globalization? Well, there are many competitors, but probably it is Levitt in the 1980s, who in fact links globalization to the emergence of multinational corporations that, thanks to high technology, can basically produce and sell the same products worldwide. Then globalization has been tackled by those promoting free market forces, such as Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chairman, who says that globalization is the best thing ever invented. Why? Because it spreads all over the world values of economic and political freedom. On the other side, my former colleague in the World Bank, Stiglitz, is quite skeptical. He thinks that globalization can in fact promote development, but also can capsize nations. Colin Powell, military, thinks that basically the ultimate objective is to minimize the pitfalls, dangers, and risk of globalization and maximizing the benefits. There's no point of being for or against globalization. It's a fact, like the weather. And Friedman, Thomas Friedman, thinks that a crucial element of globalization is culture, values. And in fact, the world is divided between those cultures that can promote the adaptation to globalization and those which resist globalization. Maybe France, who knows. Now, when did the Big Bang happen? When did, in fact, globalization start to emerge? Well, historians, from Adam Smith to Wallerstein and Gunther Frank, trace back globalization to the 15th century with long-distance trade and travel, Columbus, Vasco da Gama. From my standpoint, globalization started, with the emergence of the capitalist economy, market forces in the 19th century. In fact, we moved, to a post-Westphalia world. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia put an end to the war in the Holy Roman Empire, initiating a new system of political order in Europe based, on a sovereign state with a sovereign, a king, a prince, governing justice, finance, military, diplomatic power on a territory with clearly defined borders. Now, Polanyi makes an interesting observation regarding globalization. Namely, before the Industrial Revolution, before the 1850s, the economic system was subordinated to the social system. I mean that the church, the prince, the king, the city council, the state imposed order on the economic system within clearly defined borders and territories, the Westphalia world. At that time, markets were isolated and strongly regulated. The economy, according to Polanyi, was embedded in society. And exactly, a shift that happened. And this is why globalization put an end in the Westphalia world. Indeed, the Industrial Revolution triggered a deeply rooted social and technical reshuffling that led to both an enormous rise in productivity, but also a social system dislocation. What we see here on the screen is the sharp turnaround, the watershed that happens in the 1850s with a sharp increase in the growth rate of GDP per capita. Same happens for the population. Demographic expansion was very small, marginal, until the 19th century, and it takes off with almost 2% on average since 1850 until today. The combination of technological innovation and demographic expansion produced a sharp increase in productivity, but not before the 19th century. Indeed, until the Renaissance, there was hardly any increase in productivity. It started to accelerate in the 19th century, and of course it grew rapidly since the 1950s and also the 1980s with the NTICs. Of course, globalization did not emerge overnight. It is a byproduct of a number of dynamics, including productivity, including foreign direct investment, trade openness, economic liberalization, financial deregulation, and also the meltdown in the Soviet Union. There are four prerequisites, I think. The first one is a sharp increase in productivity. The second, economic and trade liberalization. The third one, technological progress, starting in the 50s until today, i.e. a reduction in transaction costs. And the last one is competitive market forces, the so-called responsiveness revolution. There is a premium today on competitiveness and flexibility for everyone, for companies, for banks, for insurance companies, and for business schools. Well, there were three major waves of technological innovation. The first one, starting in the 18th century until the eve of the revolution in the industry, it's basically a number of technological breakthroughs. The steam engine, for example, the cotton spinning machine, for example, railroads, of course, in Britain, in the US. The second wave started just after the Industrial Revolution, 1850s, until World War II, the modern industrial era, such as television, radio, powered flights. And the last one, much more recent, 70s, 80s, IT revolution, computers and biotechnology. These technological innovations, coupled with demographic expansion, produced a very interesting fact. For the first time ever in 1850, productivity increases so that production grows more rapidly than population, which means the two curves cross, and the first time ever you have a net increase in per capita income, as population still grows, but less rapidly than economic production. Now, of course, who is going to benefit from this sharp increase in productivity? Well, let us not forget that in the early 19th century, the great geopolitical powers were not Britain, not France, not Spain. It was China. Spain, despite the gold and silver resources that it benefited from thanks to Columbus, missed the capital accumulation. In fact, Spain ends up in the 16th century in de facto bankruptcy. It must give a call, to Dutch and British bankers and Italian bankers. The gold century for Spain ends up in a financial disaster. As Bartolomé Benassar says, gold and silver only created costly illusions. So who is going to benefit? Well, basically it's Britain, according to Kenneth Pomeranz. And why? Because Britain, benefited from easy and cheap access to large resources in coal and coke. And that was a trigger of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, allowing Britain basically to transform these raw materials into productivity thanks to key technological innovations, including steam engine, spinning machine, and railroads. The emerging globalization, can be illustrated by looking at 1850, which is a turning point. The Industrial Revolution is a watershed. We have an acceleration not only in GDP, but in GDP per capita. Now, in the meantime, as you can see, there's a growing wealth gap. In fact, basically until the 18th, 19th century, there was not much wealth gap within and between countries. But with the emergence, of industrial production in Europe, then in America, and later in Japan, we see a divide, an economic divide, between the so-called developed countries that took off and the developing countries, which for many, remains underdeveloped. And the wealth gap, in fact, explodes to reach today around 70 between, let's say, $100,000, per capita in Norway, Luxembourg, and only 400, 500, in a few African countries. Economic globalization benefited from a number of technological breakthroughs. Of course, we know the steam engine in the 1800s, electricity, telephone, railroads. But more recently, internet, computers, nanotechnologies, and probably the next technological breakthrough likely is going to be genetics. One of the key impacts of these new technologies has been, of course, to cut transaction costs and information costs. But not only we have these technological innovations, but they are transformed into markets of mass production. The market of mass production is around 50 million consumers. And it took, 70 years for the telephone to become a mass market. It took only around 40 years, for the radio, only 15 years for the computer, to reach 50 million consumers, and for the web, for internet, it took hardly 5 years, basically in the US and later in Europe. So all in all, globalization, thanks to all these technological breakthroughs, can be boiled down to the supremacy of cross-border transactions. What gets value is what is traded. So we have, in fact, two worlds. The old world is where things don't move very much. power was defined by a territory, by a population, by military power, by raw materials, tin, bauxite, coffee, cacao, and by gold and silver reserves. That's over. Today, basically, genuine global power is defined by trade of goods and services, whatever the territory. For example, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, have a very large trade openness ratio, as we're going to see. Capital flows and FDI, foreign direct investment, are key inputs of economic power. Culture, knowledge also, and what we call at Schema economic intelligence. If you look at the screen here, at the graph, what do we have? We have in red the growth rate of global GDP since 1990 until today, in fact until tomorrow, 2014. On average, GDP increases every year by 3%. If you look now at the green chart, it is no longer 3, 5, 6, it is 7%. Global trade, increases twice as much as GDP. The engine of global economic growth is not GDP, it's trade. And of course, it works both sides. When trade goes up, like in 2010, it will, pull GDP back to 3, 4%. However, in 2009, when trade goes down, falls by 10%, we have a global recession. We can see here that the global trade openness, the world ratio of trade openness, was small until the First World War, around 5-6%, Then it increases rapidly to 20% in the 1980s, and today the trade openness ratio is 32%, the ratio of global exports to global GDP. Now, this combination of globalization and new technologies has produced, not a long time ago, probably 10 years ago, the so-called globalized knowledge economy. That's a new engine of growth and of sustainable development. It is shifting the drivers of growth from physical to intellectual bases. This knowledge economy, is a new divide in the globalization. Human capital becomes the key, together with education, training, information, and economic intelligence. And that's exactly what we at Schema intend to promote. Thank you.